Yo, what's good, Spirit Squad? Today we're gonna do two things. The first is gonna be celebrating the fact that Lurrus of the Dream Den is gone from both Modern and Pioneer. And second, we're gonna take a look at what that actually means for Spirits in the world of Pioneer today. Spirits is still one of the most flexible and competitive decks in the entire format, and I'm really hyped to check out its place in the metagame with you. Well, the first selling point is that Spirits is my favorite deck, so you should play it. But seriously, Spirits is really good at being a very proactive deck, especially in the world of Pioneer, where the Lord effects happen to be even better than they are in other places. Also, when a format gets shaken up or new cards get introduced or banned, it's usually a really good idea to be the proactive player because you just don't know what you're going to be running across and you don't know what your opponents are going to be playing. And that's where you kind of want to always be attacking.
Always be closing.
The next reason you would want to play Spirits is because the deck is super disruptive. Again, we don't really know what people are going to be trying to play in these next couple of weeks. And if you want to stop what your opponents are doing on pretty much all axes, then Spirits is a pretty good choice. Between Spell Queller, Mausoleum Wanderer, and any actual counterspells we choose to play like Lofty Denial or Geistlight Snare, we usually play even more counterspells than the actual control decks. And personally, I think the biggest selling point of Spirits is that there's a ton of ways to build it. You can play Bant Company if you want to just play a bunch of Lord effects and overwhelm your opponents with power and toughness. If you're looking to control the battlefield, the same deck does the awesome thing with Skyclave Apparitions and Shacklegeists. If you want to control the spell-based decks of the format, you can play Curious Obsession in Mono Blue Spirits. You get to play Mausoleum Wanderer, a giant pile of actual counterspells, and Curious Obsession makes it so that you can draw enough cards to keep that train going. It's really oppressive. If you want to go a little bit in the middle, you can play a Spirits, and that way you can play a giant pile of creatures and some actual counterspells, giving you a happy medium. As far as playing Bant Company goes, you get a lot of really good matchups in Pioneer when you play that deck. Bant is at its best against the combat and battlefield oriented decks, so if you're looking to play against something like, say, Is It Phoenix, Orzhov Auras, or Artifact aggro, you do a really good job at controlling the battlefield using the combination of Shacklegeist and Skyclave Apparition. Collected Company helps to power these things out on schedule and at instant speed, so that makes your opponent stay really miserable. And speaking of the card Collected Company, Bant is also very good against the miscellaneous control decks of the format, especially Blue-White Control. Blue-White Control is usually trying to control the battlefield with things like March of Otherworldly Light and Supreme Verdict, but they're playing against the deck that can collect a company into any copies of Selfless Spirit, Rattle Chains, or just plain old Mausoleum Wanderer and Spell Queller, making their day really miserable when they're trying to kill your things. And now we're going to talk about the collected companies themselves in Bant, because that's really going to be the outlying factor of this deck. So the biggest questions that we usually get about Collected Company are going to be things like, how many creatures should I play? How often should I expect to hit my good cards with Collected Company? And how often can I afford to miss? Well, the last one's really easy. You can't afford to miss, so we're trying to max out Collected Company to be as good as possible. And we've actually got only 4 collected companies as non-creature spells in this entire deck. That's it. Everything else is a creature or a land. So we're trying to maximize Coco out as much as possible. The normal rule is that you want 22 creatures at least to make sure that you're able to hit 2 creatures out of your top 6 on Cocos as often as possible. And having 22 creatures in your deck will ensure that that happens roughly 72% of the time. So almost 3/4 of the time you'll see double creature. Well, we ain't about that life. 72% of the time is not all the time. We're playing 33 creatures, which gives us a little closer to a 94% chance to hit 2 creatures at least off of your Cocos. And if you'll take a look at the mana curve that we've got going on with Bant Spirits, you'll see that only 7 of our 33 creatures are going to be 1-drops. This means that everything else is going to be either a 2 or a 3-drop. In fact, 26 of our 33 creatures are 2 or 3 drops. That gives us a 78% chance to to hit something just awesome off of our collected companies, rather than having like a little bit of a mediocre, maybe I hit a 1-drop and a 2-drop. Well, who wants to cast 4 mana to get 3 mana? We're trying to cast 4 mana to get 5 or 6 at instant speed all the time. So we're maxing out on 2 and 3 drops to have that happen as often as possible. So that's going to be exactly what we're doing with Coco, just about all the times. Unless, of course, you've watched some of my gameplay channels, in which case, you know, Coco's not necessarily my friend, but hey, we're trying. The numbers are there. Maybe you're better at it than I am. And where Bant shines against the battlefield part of the format, Mono Blue Spirits shines against the spell-based part of the format, because you get to play a bunch of counter spells and Curious Obsession to help you find them. So if you're finding yourself fighting something like Jeskai Ascendancy combo, Lotus Field combo, or even Naya Winota, the number of counter spells that are in your deck to help combat these things is pretty high. Like I said before, you're actually playing even more counter spells than the actual control decks, so your matchup against these things ends up being pretty good. That's not to say that every deck isn't without its weak points though, and we do have them. We just, you know, do a pretty good job at playing around them. Our biggest weakness as far as actual decks are concerned are all going to be the ones that don't really care too much about our counter spells. So that's going to be decks that are ridiculously low to the ground. So any of the decks like Boros Heroic or Boros Prowess, those decks are typically too low to the ground to really care about what we're doing as far as tapping 2 mana and countering a spell. The same goes for Mono Red Aggro, and to an even larger extent, the Orzhov Humans deck. You'll notice the common factor in all of these decks though, is that they all played Lurrus and they all just lost Lurrus. So I expect these decks to take up a smaller share of the metagame, and that is really good for a Spirits pilot. The less of these decks are running around the format, then the better things look for us, because we're not stuck fighting all of these bad matchups. However, outside of these bad matchups, we also want to look out for some individual cards. The first big card we want to look out for is Mayhem Devil. Granted, Mayhem Devil is only in one deck, the Jund Sacrifice list, but Mayhem Devil is very good at cleaning up our battlefield, because we're playing a bunch of 1 toughness creatures. If your opponent is playing something like Mayhem Devil that can kind of like machine gun down your friends, then that's not really where you want to be as far as matchups go. The next big bad card for us is going to be Ugin the Spirit Dragon. Again, a card that's only in one deck, the Lotus Field combo deck, but it is pretty much lights out for us when that card resolves. So if you're fighting against that deck, try to make sure it doesn't. The last big card we want to talk about is going to be one that's all over the format, and that's going to be Mystical Dispute. For just 1 mana, a Mystical Dispute can counter pretty much everything in every version of our decks. So that's gonna be something that we need to just be on the lookout for. There's not really much we can do about it since we're playing a hyper interactive blue deck. So if your opponent has Mystical Dispute and you don't have a way to combat that, sucks to be you. But it's also something that we can play ourselves. So if you ever find yourself fighting like a Spirit Mirror or any of the numerous blue decks in the format, bring your own disputes, fight that fight. One of the biggest things with Spirits, since we both have multiple options as far as how to build Spirits and the Pioneer format's changing all the time, is going to be the fact that we are a relatively flexible tribe when it comes to sideboarding. And this is going to be true for both Bant Spirits and Mono Blue Spirits. Mono Blue Spirits is of course much easier to sideboard with than Bant for 2 reasons. First, you're only playing 1 color, so you only have so many options to choose from. But also, you don't have the deck building restriction that Collected Company presents, so you're allowed to play with a lot more non-creature spells in Mono Blue than you generally are with Bant's Company. For Mono Blue, I found that putting a giant pile of counter spells in the sideboard is usually the best way to win against a bunch of the slower decks in the format. And if you're playing against one of those faster, more aggressive decks in the format, then you've got a lot of 1 and 2 mana enchantments to choose from that can help lock your opponent's creatures down. Things like Bind the Monster and Mystic Subdual not only lock down your opponent's creatures, but remember, they're enchantments. That means they also play pretty nicely with Geistlight Snare. As far as actual counterspells go, Mystical Dispute is usually the best counterspell in the entire format. So I tend to play between 3 and 4 Mystical Dispute in all of my Mono Blue lists. You also get to play more hard counters too, like Test of Talents or even just straight up negate. Both are going to be some really good options. As far as sideboarding with Bant goes, that one's a little trickier for two reasons. First, you want to keep your creature count really high to make sure that your Cocos can hit as often as possible. But also, you have 3 colors to choose from, which might give some players a bit of decision paralysis. Here, I like to change my sideboard pretty often depending on what the meta is looking like. You get to play things that are white, like additional copies of Skyclave Apparition, Archon of Emeria, Portable Hole, or even Deafening Silence. You get to play a bunch of blue stuff, like any copies of Dovin's Veto or Mystical Dispute, or if you want to delve all the way into green, you get all kinds of cool stuff. I'm currently looking at Night of Autumn, but there's going to be all kinds of options and cool things that you can do with Bant. Just make sure that when you're choosing the cards that you want in your sideboard, you're keeping your creature count high so that you're not screwing yourselves out on Collected Company. But that's going to be our 2 cents on sideboarding. And the last thing we're going to talk about when playing Spirits is going to be your Mulligan decisions. I think mulliganing is already a topic that doesn't get talked about enough, let alone Spirits, just anywhere in Magic really. So this is going to be where we talk about this now. One of the big things to know about Spirits is that Spirits does not provide its pilot with additional card draw. So every single draw step you're going to see is going in pretty much blind. That means that you have to be able to play a pretty good amount of Magic with the hand you actually draw. You don't really get to sculpt hands. There's no legacy stuff like Ponder, Preordain, Brainstorm. There's no modern card draw like Icefang Coatl or Spreading Seas. You don't even get the Pioneer stuff in this deck like Consider and Treasure Cruise. You're just playing fresh off the top of your deck every time. So make your draw steps count. For example, let's take a look at this Bant Company hand. And this Bant hand has 3 lands, 4 spells, 2 of which cost 2 when you include the Brazen Borrower's Petty Theft, and is pretty interactive, especially if you draw a Collected Company. But there's 2 major problems with this hand. The first major problem is going to be that there is no white source in this hand. So with the Selfless Spirit and the 2 Spell Quellers, if you don't draw a white source, you've already basically discarded 3 cards from your hand. Nobody likes a mulligan to 4. Also, if you're on the draw, you don't really have a good turn 2 play here. Like a Selfless Spirit is pretty good if you play, on the play, you draw a white source, things go right, you get a Selfless Spirit, you back it up with 2 Spell Quellers, life is okay. But if you're on the draw, then you're just playing like a 2-1 on turn 2 with nothing else really to do or say. You can't protect it or do anything. Like, what are you really doing with this hand? So this is going to be a hand that even though you've got 4 creatures and 3 lands, this one's a pretty easy mulligan. And taking a look at this hand with mono blue is one that I would be really sketchy to keep. See, we've got 1 island and 1 Faceless Haven. We've got 3 1-drops in our Spectral Sailors, Mausoleum Wanderer. We've also got a Curious Obsession and a Rattlechains to back it up. But on the play, this hand is actually pretty acceptable. What I would do with this hand would be to play an island, flash in Spectral Sailor, untap, and then put Curious Obsession on a Spectral Sailor. That way, if we can draw a blue source with Mausoleum Wanderer, we can use the Wanderer to protect the Sailor and potentially draw more than 1 card. Or you can try to draw a 3rd land, and if it's an island, you can play Curious Obsession on a Spectral Sailor and then protect it with Rattlechains. But if you're on the draw, this hand is going to be one of those ones that's relatively miserable, because without guaranteeing a 2nd blue source here, you're not ever guaranteed to being able to protect that Curious Obsession, whatever creature you put it on. So this is going to be one that you'll have to be really wary with, even if it's a pretty good hand when it does succeed. Proceed with caution. And these are just going to be a couple of examples of things to kind of be on the lookout for when deciding whether you want to keep or ship your opening hands. In the case of the Bant hand, that hand just honestly straight up didn't do anything, even though we saw a decent combination of both lands and spells. In that hand, the 2 just didn't really match. And in the mono blue hand, we saw a much more stable looking hand, but in practice, it actually ends up being a trap because of the fact that we're not able to reliably cast all of our spells, and we're not guaranteed to see the blue source in the mono blue hand to be able to cast all of our spells. So If you want to keep that hand, you're totally allowed, but you really need to kind of proceed with caution when playing it. And these are going to be a couple of the things that we want to look out for when playing a deck that's as fragile as Spirits. We want to make sure that we're getting each of our draw steps and each of our opening hands right so that we can win games. So that's going to be it for our little quick hits on both gameplay and deck construction for Bant and Mono Blue Spirits. You'll see that we got to talk a little bit more about how to construct your decks, why Collected Company is good in Bant, why things like Counterspells and Curious Obsession are good in Mono Blue. We got to see how to approach some matchups, how to sideboard a little bit, and how to approach your starting hands. So I think we've gotten to learn quite a bit today. If you want to watch more gameplay with these decks, I've actually posted links to a full gameplay video for each of Mono Blue and Bant right in the video description, so make sure to check those out along with the actual links to the deck lists themselves. As always, if you like what you're watching today, make sure to actually click like on this video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. You never have to worry about any of your cards getting banned if you just don't play good cards.
Emotional damage!